The first thing people noticed wasn't her face. It was the way the room seemed to shift around her, as if every light, every whisper, every breath had been waiting for that exact second to change direction. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of the ballroom beneath a ceiling of crystal chandeliers, his voice steady, controlled, practiced, the kind of voice that moved markets and closed eight-figure deals. His tailored black tuxedo fitting like it had been measured for power itself, one hand resting lightly against the podium as he addressed a room filled with executives, investors, and cameras that never blinked. The Caldwell Global Annual Gala unfolding exactly as planned, every detail aligned, every movement rehearsed, every outcome predictable, because Ethan Caldwell did not leave space for unpredictability, not in business, not in life, not anymore, and certainly not tonight. The applause came in waves, polite, measured, echoing off marble and glass, the sound of success, the sound of control, the sound of a man who had built an empire by choosing logic over emotion every single time. But just as he lifted his gaze toward the far end of the room, just as the next line of his speech formed quietly behind his teeth, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened without announcement, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to break the rhythm of the night. And something in his chest tightened before his mind could catch up, because there are moments the body recognizes long before the brain dares to name them. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, didn't look around to see who was watching. Ava Brooks stepped into the light like she had never left it, her presence quiet but undeniable, her posture straight, her pace unhurried, a deep emerald dress falling clean along her frame, not extravagant, not loud, just precise, intentional. The kind of elegance that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway, her skin catching the chandelier light in warm tones that softened nothing and revealed everything. Her expression composed, unreadable, the same calm she had worn years ago when she learned how to survive without anyone's permission, but she wasn't alone, and that was the part that made the air in the room shift in ways no one could quite explain. A small hand rested in hers, fingers curled gently but firmly, the grip of a child who trusted without question, and the boy beside her walked with a quiet steadiness that didn't belong to someone his age, maybe 5, maybe 6, his dark curls neat, his suit tailored just enough to match the room without trying to compete with it, his eyes scanning the space with curiosity rather than fear, absorbing everything, without needing to understand it yet. And for a moment, for a single, fragile second, the entire ballroom existed in two separate timelines. One where Ethan Caldwell was still in control, still delivering his speech, still the man who had chosen power over everything else. And another where that control began to fracture under the weight of something he had buried so completely he had convinced himself it no longer existed. The first camera flash didn't come from the stage. It came from the side of the room, subtle but sharp, followed by another, and then another, as attention shifted like a current pulling every gaze toward the back, whispers rising in low waves, names being guessed, connections being drawn, because rooms like this thrived on recognition, on knowing who mattered and why. But no one here had been prepared for her, not tonight, not here, and certainly not with him standing at the center of it all. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the podium, a movement so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who didn't know how still he usually kept himself, his breath steady, measured, but something underneath it had changed, something he could not immediately categorize or control. And when his eyes finally settled fully on her, when recognition moved past instinct and into certainty, the world he had constructed with such precision began to narrow, not collapsing, not yet, but bending in ways he could feel without understanding. Ava didn't look at him right away, not even as she moved deeper into the room, guiding the boy with the kind of ease that came from repetition, from years of doing it alone, her focus forward, her steps aligned with purpose rather than reaction, as if this moment had already been lived in her mind and resolved long before she chose to step into it. And that was what made it different, what made it dangerous in a way no negotiation or hostile takeover had ever been. Because this was not chaos. This was intention. Ethan's voice didn't break, not externally, not yet. He continued speaking for a few more seconds, words leaving his mouth with practiced clarity, but meaning began to slip between them, sentences forming without landing. His attention no longer anchored to the script in front of him, but pulled, steadily and completely, toward the woman he had once told did not belong in his future. The woman he had walked away from in a room just as polished, just as controlled, choosing contracts over connection, choosing growth over uncertainty, choosing a version of success that had no space for hesitation. And in that moment, as the distance between them shortened with each step she took, the memory he had buried resurfaced not as a thought, but as a presence, sharp and undeniable. The boy glanced up at Ava, tugging lightly at her hand as if asking a question without words, and she leaned down just slightly, just enough to hear him, her expression softening in a way that didn't reach anyone else, her voice too low to carry beyond them. A private exchange in a room built entirely on public image. And when she straightened again, when her gaze finally lifted and met Ethan's across the space, that now felt too small to contain what was happening, there was no anger there, no accusation, no trace of the woman he had left behind, only a calm, steady awareness that made everything else in the room feel temporary by comparison. The applause had faded without anyone noticing. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips, because something deeper than curiosity had taken hold, something that felt less like spectacle and more like a shift no one could fully explain. But everyone could feel, and Ethan, standing under the weight of 100 watching eyes, realized for the first time in years that control was not something you could maintain simply by refusing to acknowledge what threatened it. Sometimes it arrived anyway, uninvited, unannounced, carrying with it a past you had chosen to forget and a future you no longer had the power to define on your own. The boy's gaze drifted again, this time landing on Ethan, holding there for a fraction longer than coincidence would allow. And there was something in that look, something in the shape of his eyes, the set of his expression, a familiarity that didn't need explanation, didn't need confirmation. It simply existed, quiet and undeniable, and Ethan felt it before he understood it. A recognition that moved through him like a silent fracture, precise, contained, but impossible to ignore. Ava didn't move closer after that. She didn't call out, didn't disrupt the room in any obvious way. She simply stood there with the same quiet strength that had carried her through everything he had never seen. Her hand still holding the boy's, her presence enough, more than enough, to change the direction of a night that had been built entirely around him. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that stage, Ethan Caldwell had nothing to say, not because he didn't know how, but because the truth standing across from him had already said everything without a single word. The silence did not fall all at once. It settled slowly, like a weight pressing down on the room, tightening every breath, sharpening every glance, and Ethan Caldwell felt it before he understood it. The subtle shift from admiration to attention, from routine to something far less predictable, his hand still resting against the podium, as if it could anchor him back into the version of the night he had planned. But the words in front of him no longer held shape. The speech he had delivered, countless times in countless variations, now reduced to fragments that no longer mattered because none of it could compete with the presence standing across the room, unmoving, unshaken, and completely outside of his control. He exhaled once, slow and measured, the kind of breath that had carried him through negotiations worth millions, the kind that steadied him in rooms where hesitation cost everything. But this was different. This was not a deal to close or a strategy to execute. This was something personal in a way he had trained himself to avoid, and for a brief moment, just long enough for the nearest cameras to capture the flicker in his eyes, he stopped speaking. The host standing near the stage shifted slightly, unsure whether to step in or remain invisible. The orchestra at the edge of the ballroom holding their instruments in quiet anticipation, waiting for a signal that did not come, because the rhythm of the evening had broken in a place no one had prepared for, and all attention now belonged to the woman who had not said a single word. Ava did not rush to fill the silence. She did not seek the spotlight that had naturally turned toward her. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the boy's hand, her thumb brushing lightly over his fingers in a small, grounding motion, and he responded by stepping half a pace closer to her side, not out of fear, but out of familiarity, the kind of instinct that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. And that quiet exchange, simple and unforced, carried more weight than anything spoken from the stage. Ethan's gaze dropped, not intentionally, not fully, just enough to trace the line from her face to the child beside her. And the closer he looked, the harder it became to dismiss what he was seeing as coincidence. The curve of the boy's cheek, the way his brow settled when he focused, even the slight tilt of his head as he observed the room, details that did not announce themselves loudly but settled into recognition with an unsettling clarity. And Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against the edge of his composure. Not panic, not yet, but something that threatened to unravel the careful distance he had maintained for years. The boy's voice broke through the silence, soft but clear, the kind of tone that carried just enough to be heard without trying to command attention. "Mom, is that the man you told me about?" And the question, simple and structure, landed with a precision that no accusation ever could, because it did not come with anger or expectation, only curiosity, and in a room filled with people who built their lives on controlling narratives, it was the one thing no one could redirect. Ava did not answer immediately. She did not rush to correct or soften the moment. Instead, she looked down at him, her expression steady, her eyes holding a depth that came from years of choosing what to say and what to leave unsaid. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained low, meant for him but heard by more than just his ears. "Yes," she said simply, "that is him." And there was no bitterness in the words, no attempt to shape the past into something else, only a quiet acknowledgement of truth, and that made it heavier than anything else she could have said. Ethan's chest tightened, not visibly, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough that his next breath came a fraction slower, and he straightened slightly, instinctively reclaiming the posture that had defined him in every public setting, his shoulders squared, his expression resetting into something controlled, composed, but the control felt thinner, now, stretched across something it could not fully contain. And when he finally stepped away from the podium, the movement was deliberate, measured, each step calculated to appear intentional even as the ground beneath him shifted in ways he could not fully map. The room parted subtly as he moved, not out of command, but out of instinct, the people closest to him stepping just enough to create a path, their eyes following him, their attention no longer divided between business and spectacle. Because this was no longer either of those things, this was something else entirely, something that did not belong to the agenda printed on their tables or the schedule outlined in their invitations. Ava remained where she was, not retreating, not advancing, allowing him to close the distance on his own terms, or what remained of them. And when he finally stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the details he had tried not to notice, the faint line of strength in her posture, the steadiness in her gaze, the undeniable presence of the child beside her, the silence between them held more history than any conversation could contain. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that space, the past lingered without needing to be named. The memory of a different room, a different choice, the sound of his own voice telling her she did not fit into the life he was building, the certainty he had carried then now standing in direct contrast to the uncertainty he could not hide now. He looked at her first, not the child, not yet, as if searching for something in her expression that could explain what stood in front of him. But Ava offered nothing beyond what she chose to reveal, her calm, unbroken, her presence grounded in something that did not depend on his reaction. And that was what unsettled him most, not anger, not confrontation, but the absence of both. Finally, his gaze shifted, settling fully on the boy, and the longer he looked, the harder it became to maintain distance, because recognition does not require permission, it simply exists, and in that moment, it settled into place with a quiet finality, the kind that does not ask questions but answers them without words. The boy met his gaze without hesitation, his expression open, curious, studying the man in front of him with the same quiet confidence he had carried into the room. And after a brief pause, he spoke again, this time directly. "Hi," he said, the single word simple, unguarded, carrying none of the weight that surrounded it, because to him, this was not a confrontation, it was an introduction. And that difference shifted something deep within Ethan, something he had not felt in years, something that did not align with control or strategy, but with something far less defined and far more difficult to navigate. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, But for a second, nothing came out. The words he was used to relying on suddenly inadequate, insufficient, and he found himself doing something he had not done in a long time. Choosing his next sentence not for impact, not for precision, but for truth. And even then, it came slower than expected. "Hello," he said finally, his voice lower now, less practiced, more real. And in that single exchange, brief and understated, the foundation of everything he had built began to shift, not collapsing, not yet, but moving in a direction he could no longer fully control. The air between them did not break. It tightened, stretching thin with the weight of everything that had not been said. And for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell stood in a room where silence was not his to control, where the absence of words carried more consequence than any statement he could deliver, his gaze still resting on the boy, as if looking away might undo what he had already begun to understand. But recognition does not reverse itself. It settles deeper, rooting into places that logic cannot reach. And the more he tried to steady his thoughts, the clearer the truth became, not loud, not dramatic, but precise in a way that left no space for denial. Ava shifted slightly, not to shield the child, not to pull him back, but to remain exactly where she had chosen to stand, grounded, present, her hand still holding his with quiet certainty. And when she looked at Ethan again, there was no urgency in her expression, no demand for explanation, only a calm that suggested she had already walked through every version of this moment long before it arrived. And that was what made it different, what made it final in a way that no confrontation ever could. Around them, the room began to move again, but not fully, not naturally. Conversations resumed in fragments, voices lowered, glances exchanged, because even in a space built for appearances, something real had entered, something that could not be redirected into small talk or polite distraction. And the cameras, though subtle, remained present, capturing angles, expressions, reactions, preserving a moment that no one would fully understand but no one would forget. Ethan's assistant appeared at the edge of his vision, a step closer than usual, posture alert, ready to intervene, to redirect, to restore order in whatever way was needed. But Ethan lifted his hand just slightly, not looking away from Ava, not breaking the fragile line that had formed between them, and the gesture alone was enough to hold everything else back, to delay the machinery of control he had built around himself for so long. The boy tilted his head again, studying Ethan with an openness that did not match the tension surrounding them, and after a brief pause, he spoke once more, his voice carrying a quiet curiosity that cut through the room in a way no raised voice ever could. "Mom says you build big companies," he said, his words simple, almost conversational, as if he were asking about something he had seen in a book or heard in a story. And Ethan felt the weight of that sentence land in a place he had not prepared for, because it carried no judgment, no expectation, only a connection that had been formed. Without his presence, Ethan nodded slowly, the movement small but deliberate, his voice steadier now, though not fully returned to its usual precision. "I do," he replied, and for a second, he considered adding something more, something that would reframe the moment, but nothing came that felt true enough to say, and that absence lingered between them. The boy's expression shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in thought, as if measuring the answer against something he already understood, and then he asked the question that no one else in the room would have dared to speak. "Why did you not stay?" And the words, unguarded and direct, landed with a clarity that cut through every layer of control Ethan had built. Because this was not a negotiation, not a challenge, not even an accusation. It was a simple question from someone who deserved an answer, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan found himself without one that could fit neatly into the version of himself he had created. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the boy's hand, not to stop him, not to correct him, but to ground him, to remind him without words that he was not alone in asking what needed to be asked. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, not directed at Ethan but not avoiding him either. "Some people make choices before they understand what they are choosing," she said, her tone even, her words carrying no bitterness, only truth shaped by time. And the way she said it made it clear that the explanation was not for the room, not even entirely for Ethan, but for the child who stood beside her. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because the statement did not accuse him. It simply described him, and that distinction made it harder to deflect, harder to argue against, because it left no space for defense, only reflection. He took a breath, deeper this time, allowing the noise of the room to settle just enough for him to hear himself think, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less of the polished edge it was known for and more of something unpracticed, something real. "I thought I was building something that required all of me," he said, his eyes shifting briefly from Ava to the boy and back again. "And I believed that meant leaving anything behind that did not fit into it." And as the words left him, he realized how incomplete they sounded, how much they explained and how little they justified. But they were the closest thing to truth he had allowed himself to say in years. The boy listened, his expression thoughtful, absorbing the answer in a way that did not rush to judge it. And then he nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement, as if placing the information somewhere he would return to later. And that simple response, that lack of immediate reaction, unsettled Ethan more than any rejection could have, because it suggested something he was not used to facing: time, the kind that did not bend to urgency or authority. Ava looked at Ethan then, fully, her gaze steady, not searching, not questioning, simply meeting him where he stood. And in that moment, the distance between who they had been and who they were now became undeniable, not because of what had happened, but because of how they carried it. She with quiet strength, he with a control that was beginning to show its limits. The music at the edge of the room resumed softly, tentative at first, as if testing whether the moment had passed, but the shift in the air remained, subtle but permanent, because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. And even as conversations began to pick up again, even as the structure of the evening attempted to reassert itself, the focus of the room had already changed, no longer centered on the man at the podium, but on the truth standing in front of him, calm, composed, and impossible to ignore. Ethan glanced around briefly, not to escape the moment, but to register its impact, the way eyes lingered a fraction longer, the way voices stayed lower, the way attention no longer followed his movement alone. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to stand in a room where his influence was not the only force shaping what happened next. He returned his focus to Ava, his expression no longer guarded in the same way, something in it softer, though not yet fully defined, and he spoke quietly, not for the room, not even entirely for her, but because the words needed to exist. "What is his name?" And the question, simple as it was, carried a weight that reached beyond introduction, beyond formality, into something that acknowledged what stood between them as real, undeniable, and no longer separate from him. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer before answering, her voice steady, clear. "His name is Daniel," she said, and the name settled into the space between them with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forced, but complete. And as Ethan repeated it silently in his mind, feeling its shape, its presence, something within him shifted again, deeper this time, not breaking, not collapsing, but moving in a direction he had never planned for and could no longer avoid. The name did not echo in the room. It settled, quiet and steady, as if it had always been there waiting to be acknowledged, and Ethan Caldwell felt it land somewhere deeper than recognition, somewhere that did not respond to logic or control, but to something far more immediate, far more personal. "Daniel." He repeated it once in his mind, carefully, as if saying it too quickly might make it less real, but the weight of it remained, firm and undeniable. The boy looked up at him again, not expecting anything dramatic, not searching for approval, simply observing, the way children do when they are learning where they stand in a moment that feels important but not yet defined. And there was something in that calm curiosity that made Ethan hesitate, not because he did not know how to respond, but because for once, he understood that whatever he said next would not shape the moment, it would reveal him. Ava remained still beside Daniel, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in something that did not shift with the attention around them. And as the music slowly found its rhythm again at the edge of the room, the world attempted to resume its structure, but the center of gravity had already moved, no longer anchored to the stage, no longer defined by the script of the evening, but by the quiet truth standing in the middle of it. Ethan glanced briefly toward the stage, toward the podium where his speech still waited unfinished, the notes untouched, the carefully prepared words now irrelevant, and for a fraction of a second, he considered returning, reclaiming the narrative, restoring the order he had always relied on. But the thought passed just as quickly as it came, because the version of control he had mastered did not apply here, not in a moment that was not built for performance. Instead, he shifted his focus back to Ava and Daniel, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Daniel," he said aloud this time, not testing the name but accepting it, and the boy responded with a small nod, not as a gesture of approval, but as acknowledgement, as if confirming that the connection had been made and would not be undone by ignoring it. A server passed nearby carrying a tray of glasses, pausing just long enough to sense the tension before moving on, and around them, conversations continued in fragments, quieter than before, more careful, because even without understanding the full story, the room recognized that something significant had entered it, something that did not belong to business or presentation, but to something far more human. Ethan's assistant stepped closer again, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Sir, we can move this to a private room." The suggestion precise, efficient, offering a solution that aligned with every instinct Ethan had ever followed, contained the situation. Control the environment, limit exposure, but Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on Ava, measuring something that could not be reduced to strategy, and after a brief pause, he shook his head slightly, the movement small but definitive. "No," he said quietly, not harsh, not dismissive, just certain, and with that single word, he chose something he had not chosen in a long time, to remain present in a moment that did not serve him. Ava's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not approval, not surprise, just a recognition that he had stepped, however slightly, outside of the version of himself she had known, and that change, small as it was, carried its own weight. Daniel shifted his stance, looking between them, and then back at Ethan. "Do you live here?" he asked, the question simple, grounded in the immediate, and Ethan nodded again, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Yes, I do," he replied, and the boy considered that for a second before asking, "Is this your party?" And there was no challenge in the question, only curiosity, but Ethan felt the irony settle into it anyway, because the answer was yes. And yet the control that came with that ownership no longer felt complete. "Yes," he said again, and this time there was a faint shift in his tone, something closer to humility than certainty, and Daniel nodded once more, absorbing the information without reacting to its implications, because for him, the structure of the evening did not matter as much as the people within it. Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm, measured. "We are not here to interrupt your night," she said, not apologizing, not asking permission, simply stating a boundary that had already been respected. "We were invited," and the words carried their own quiet significance, because they confirmed that this moment had not been accidental, not entirely, that her presence here had been a choice, deliberate and considered, and Ethan felt that realization settle alongside everything else, adding another layer to a situation he could no longer simplify. He nodded slowly, acknowledging her words, his mind moving through possibilities, through questions that did not yet have answers, but he did not rush to ask them, did not push forward with the urgency that had defined him in every other part of his life, because something in him understood that this was not a moment to control, but one to face. The light from the chandeliers shifted slightly as someone adjusted the dimming system, casting softer tones across the room, and in that subtle change, the edges of everything felt less sharp, less performative, as if the space itself had adapted to what was unfolding within it. Ethan glanced at Daniel again, taking in the details he had not allowed himself to see before, the way the boy held himself, the quiet confidence in his stance, the absence of fear in his eyes, and he realized, with a clarity that did not need confirmation, that whatever distance he had created years ago had not erased what connected them. It had only delayed this moment. "How old are you?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper, and Daniel answered without hesitation. "I am 5, his voice steady, and the number landed with a precision that aligned too perfectly with the timeline Ethan had tried not to reconstruct, the years folding into place in a way that left no gaps, no room for interpretation, only acceptance. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath longer this time, not forced, not controlled, just real, and for a moment, he allowed himself to stand there without calculating the next move, without preparing the next statement, simply present in the reality he had once chosen to leave behind. Ava watched him, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with a quiet awareness that suggested she had already lived through the part of the story where his reaction determined the outcome, and that now, whatever came next would be shaped by something else entirely. The music continued softly, the room gradually finding its rhythm again. But the center of the evening had shifted permanently, and as Ethan stood there, facing both the past he had walked away from and the future he had never planned for, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that control was not about choosing what existed, but about choosing how to respond to what could no longer be undone. The question about his age did not fade after it was answered. It lingered, threading itself through everything that followed, reshaping the way Ethan Caldwell stood, the way he breathed, the way he looked at the boy in front of him, as if the number 5 had quietly redrawn the past in ways he could no longer ignore. And for a moment, just long enough to feel unfamiliar, he did not move forward with intention. He remained still, allowing the reality of it to settle without resistance. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his small hand still anchored in Ava's, his presence calm, untroubled by the tension that surrounded them, because to him, this was not a disruption. It was simply a moment unfolding, and that difference, that quiet ease, created a contrast so sharp that Ethan felt it without knowing how to respond to it. The music in the background steadied, a soft instrumental piece filling the space with something that tried to return the evening to its original shape. But it could not fully erase what had already changed, and the light above them reflected in polished glass and marble, creating a sense of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the room itself had paused to witness what would happen next. Ethan's gaze moved from Daniel back to Ava, searching not for answers this time, but for alignment, for something that could help him understand how she had carried all of this without him, how she had built a life that now stood in front of him complete, steady, and unshaken by his presence. And the realization that she had done it alone did not arrive as guilt at first. It arrived as recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of strength he had once underestimated. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and there was something in the way she stood, not guarded, not defensive, but fully present, that made it clear she was not here to revisit what had already been lived. She was here because this moment existed, because the past had led here whether he was ready for it or not. Ethan took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the room pressing in at the edges, the awareness that every movement, every word, still carried visibility. But instead of retreating into the distance that had always protected him, he stepped slightly closer, not enough to intrude, not enough to assume anything that had not been given, but enough to show that he was no longer standing apart from what was in front of him. "You have done well," he said quietly, his voice directed toward Ava, the words simple, but carrying a depth that extended beyond the moment, beyond the years, an acknowledgement that did not attempt to claim credit or rewrite history. And Ava held his gaze for a second longer before responding, her voice calm, steady. "I did what was necessary," she said, and the way she said it left no space for interpretation. It was not a statement of pride or defiance. It was a fact, grounded in reality, shaped by time. Daniel looked between them again, his attention moving naturally, absorbing the exchange without fully understanding its weight, and then his eyes settled on Ethan once more. "Do you work all the time?" he asked, the question innocent, unfiltered, and Ethan felt a faint shift in his chest, because the question was simple, but the answer was not. And for the first time, he considered not just what he would say, but what the answer meant beyond the words. "I used to," he replied after a brief pause, his tone softer now, less defined by certainty. "I thought that was what mattered most." And Daniel nodded as if that made sense, because in a child's world, explanations did not need to be perfect, they only needed to exist. Ava watched the exchange quietly, her presence unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something that suggested she was listening not just to the words, but to what existed underneath them, measuring not what he said, but what had changed in the way he said it. A group of guests passed behind them, their conversation lowered, their attention flickering briefly toward the trio before moving on, the ripple of curiosity continuing through the room in subtle waves, but no one approached, no one interrupted, as if an unspoken understanding had settled that this moment did not belong to anyone else. Ethan glanced briefly at the surrounding space again, the familiarity of it now, layered with something unfamiliar, something that did not respond to his presence the way it always had. And when he returned his focus to Ava, his voice carried a quiet shift. "I did not know," he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a truth he could no longer avoid. And Ava nodded once, a small, controlled movement. "I know," she replied, her tone even, and there was no accusation in it, no attempt to assign blame, only acknowledgement, and that made it harder to stand behind, because it removed the space where arguments usually lived. Daniel adjusted his stance again, his attention drawn briefly to something across the room before returning to them, and then he asked, "Are you going to stay?" And the question, though simple, carried a different kind of weight, not about the past, but about what came next, and Ethan felt it settle into him with a quiet intensity, because this was not something he could answer with certainty, not yet, not without understanding what staying meant now, what it required, what it would change. He looked at Daniel, then at Ava, and for a moment, he allowed the question to exist without rushing to resolve it. "I would like to," he said finally, his voice steady but unforced, and the words did not promise more than he could give. They did not attempt to define something that had not yet been built. They simply opened a space where something new could begin, and Daniel nodded again, accepting the answer as it was, without needing more, because for him, possibility was enough. Ava's gaze remained steady on Ethan, and though her expression did not change, there was a quiet shift in the air between them, something subtle, not forgiveness, not acceptance, but recognition. The acknowledgement that the moment had moved forward, that the past, while unchanged, no longer held complete control over what came next. The music continued, the room slowly returning to its rhythm, but the center had shifted permanently, and as Ethan stood there, no longer separate from the reality he had once left behind, he understood that this was not a moment he could resolve with a single decision. It was something that would unfold over time, something that would require more than words, more than intention, something that would demand a different version of him than the one who had stood at the podium earlier that night, and for the first time in years. That realization did not feel like a loss of control. It felt like the beginning of something he had never allowed himself to consider. The word "stay" did not dissolve after it was spoken. It lingered between them with a quiet uncertainty that neither rushed to define nor tried to dismiss. And for a moment the space around Ethan Caldwell felt narrower, not because of the crowd or the room, but because the meaning of that single word stretched beyond the moment into something that would require more than presence, more than intention, something that would demand consistency over time. And he knew it even as he stood there, even as Daniel accepted the answer with the simple ease of someone who had not yet learned to question promises. Ava shifted her weight slightly, her hand still resting in Daniel's, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle recalibration in the way she held herself, as if acknowledging the shift without allowing it to alter her center. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every word she had chosen so far. "Staying is not a sentence," she said quietly, not correcting him, not challenging him, but placing the truth exactly where it belonged. And Ethan felt the distinction settle immediately, because she was not responding to the word itself, she was responding to what it implied, to the weight behind it, to the difference between saying something and living it. Daniel looked up at her, then back at Ethan, his expression thoughtful but not troubled, and for him the conversation still existed in the present, still anchored in what was happening now rather than what it meant long term. And that difference created a quiet contrast that Ethan could not ignore, because it revealed something simple and undeniable, that the child standing in front of him had built his understanding of the world without him, and whatever came next would not begin from zero, it would begin from absence. the music shifted again, a slightly brighter tone moving through the room as if attempting to restore the energy that had been interrupted, and guests began to circulate more freely, though their attention continued to flicker toward the three of them in subtle, careful glances, because even as the evening moved forward, the moment they had witnessed had not lost its presence. It had only settled deeper into the atmosphere. Ethan exhaled slowly, not forcing the breath, allowing it to steady him in a way that did not rely on control. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less about certainty and more about acknowledgement. "I understand," he said, looking directly at Ava, and the words were simple, but they did not attempt to close the distance between them. They simply recognized it, and that made them more real than anything else he could have said. Ava held his gaze for a brief moment before nodding once, not in agreement, not in approval, but in recognition of the shift, and then her attention moved back to Daniel, her hand gently adjusting his sleeve, a small, natural gesture that carried the quiet rhythm of years lived together, years built without interruption, and Ethan watched it with a clarity that did not soften the truth but made it sharper, more defined, because it showed him what he had not been part of, not in an abstract way, but in a series of simple, everyday moments that had accumulated into something whole. Daniel glanced toward the far side of the room where a display of small desserts had been set out, his attention momentarily drawn by something familiar and immediate, and he looked back at Ava. "Can I get one?" he asked, his voice carrying the same calm curiosity that had shaped every question he had asked so far, and Ava nodded gently. "Stay where I can see you," she replied, her tone steady, and Daniel released her hand without hesitation, stepping a few feet away, but not far, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who understood boundaries without needing them explained in detail. Ethan watched him go, his gaze following the small, steady movements, the way Daniel navigated the room without uncertainty, and for a moment, something shifted again inside him, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but present, a realization that connection was not built in moments like this alone, it was built in all the moments that came before, the ones he had not been there for. Ava's attention returned to Ethan, and in the absence of Daniel's immediate presence, the space between them felt different, less defined by the child and more by the history that remained unspoken, and for a second neither of them filled it, allowing the quiet to exist without urgency. "You chose your path," Ava said finally, her voice even, not heavy with emotion, not light with dismissal, simply grounded in truth. "And I chose mine." And the way she said it made it clear that there was no competition between those choices, no comparison to be made. They were simply separate, and had been for a long time. Ethan nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, accepting the statement without trying to reshape it, because he understood now that there was nothing to argue against, nothing to reinterpret, only something to face. "I did," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not attempt to justify the past, it only acknowledged it. Ava's gaze softened slightly, not in a way that erased distance, but in a way that recognized something had shifted in him, something that had not been there before, and that subtle change, though small, altered the tone of the moment in a way that could not be reversed. Daniel returned a moment later, holding a small plate carefully in both hands, his steps measured as he approached, and he looked up at Ethan again, offering a quiet smile that was not performative, not cautious, simply natural, and that expression, simple as it was, carried a weight Ethan could not ignore, because it was given without expectation, without history, and that made it more significant than anything else in the room. "Do you want one?" Daniel asked, holding the plate slightly forward, and the gesture, small and unforced, landed with a quiet impact that no formal invitation ever could, because it was not about the dessert, it was about inclusion, about extending something without conditions, and Ethan paused for a brief second before responding, not because he did not understand the question, but because he understood what accepting it meant. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but softer than before, and he reached out, taking one of the small pieces carefully, the movement deliberate, unhurried, and as he did, he felt something shift again, something that had nothing to do with the room or the event or the structure of the evening, something that existed entirely within the space between him and the child who stood in front of him without hesitation. Ava watched the exchange quietly, her expression unchanged, but her presence fully engaged, and in that moment, without words, something new took shape, not resolved, not defined, but real, a beginning that did not erase the past, but did not depend on it either. The music continued, the room moved, conversations flowed, but for Ethan Caldwell, the center of the night had shifted completely, no longer defined by what he had built, but by what he had found, and for the first time in a long time. He did not try to control what came next. He simply remained, present in a moment that asked for more than power, more than success, something quieter, something steadier, something he had once left behind and now had to learn how to face. The small gesture lingered longer than it should have, not because of the dessert itself, but because of what it represented. And as Ethan Caldwell held the delicate piece between his fingers, he realized that the simplest actions often carried the most weight when they came without expectation, without negotiation, without the structure he had built his entire life around. Daniel watched him take a bite with quiet attention, not seeking approval, not measuring the response, simply sharing a moment the way children do, freely and without calculation. And when Ethan nodded slightly, offering a soft, "It is good," the boy smiled in a way that felt unguarded and real, a reaction that did not belong to the room, the event, or the expectations surrounding them, but to something far more immediate and honest. Ava observed the exchange without interruption, her posture steady, her expression composed. But there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself, a quiet awareness that this moment, however small, marked a change that could not be undone, not because it resolved anything, but because it began something. The music swelled slightly, a gentle rise that signaled the continuation of the evening, and across the ballroom, guests began returning to their conversations with more confidence, though the occasional glance still drifted toward the trio. Curiosity now softened into something more reflective, less about spectacle and more about understanding. Even if that understanding remained incomplete, Ethan placed the empty plate onto a passing tray, his movements measured but no longer rigid. And when he looked back at Daniel, there was something different in his gaze, something that had shifted from observation to presence, as if he were no longer trying to process the moment from a distance, but had stepped into it fully, accepting that it could not be simplified or controlled. "Do you like these events?" he asked, his voice low enough to remain within their space. And Daniel considered the question for a second, his head tilting slightly as he thought. "They are loud," he said honestly, "but Mom says they are important sometimes." And Ethan felt a faint shift at those words, because they reflected a perspective shaped by someone else's guidance, someone else's explanation of a world he had never been part of for this child, and yet now stood at the center of. Ava met Ethan's gaze briefly, not explaining, not elaborating, but allowing the statement to exist as it was, and in that simplicity, it carried a quiet truth, that the life she had built for Daniel did not exclude the world Ethan represented, it simply did not depend on it. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the response, and for a moment, he allowed himself to see the room through Daniel's perspective, the lights, the sound, the movement, all of it existing without the layers of strategy and expectation he had always associated with it. And that shift, small as it was, altered the way he stood within it. A brief pause settled between them, not uncomfortable, not empty, but reflective, and in that space, Ethan found himself looking at Ava again, not as someone from his past, not as a variable he needed to account for, but as the person standing in front of him now, someone who had built a life defined by her own choices, her own strength, and the clarity of that realization made everything else feel secondary. "You did not reach out," he said quietly, not accusing, not questioning, simply acknowledging a piece of the past that had remained unresolved, and Ava held his gaze without hesitation, her response immediate but calm. "You made it clear there was nothing to reach out to," she said, her tone steady, and there was no edge in her voice, no attempt to reopen what had already been lived, only a truth that stood on its own, and Ethan felt it land without resistance, because he recognized it as accurate. He exhaled slowly, the breath carrying more than the moment, and for the first time, He did not try to reshape the narrative, did not attempt to soften it with explanation or justification. He simply accepted it, and that acceptance, though quiet, marked a shift that could not be undone. Daniel glanced between them again, sensing the change without fully understanding it. And then his attention shifted back to something immediate, something grounded. "Can we stay a little longer?" he asked Ava, his voice carrying a quiet hope, and she looked down at him, her expression softening just slightly. "A little," she replied, and he nodded, satisfied, turning his attention back to the room with a calm curiosity that remained untouched by the complexity surrounding him. Ethan watched that exchange, the ease, the balance, the unspoken understanding between them, and something within him settled, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that what stood before him was not fragile. It was not something that required his presence to exist. It was something that had been built without him and would continue regardless of what he chose to do next. And that realization, rather than pushing him away, drew him closer in a way he had not expected. He shifted his stance slightly, his posture less rigid now, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet sincerity that had not been present earlier in the night. "I would like to spend more time with both of you," he said, the words measured but genuine, and they did not demand an answer, did not assume acceptance. They simply opened a possibility, and Ava considered them for a moment, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and then she nodded once, not as agreement, not as commitment, but as acknowledgement that the statement had been made. "Time will show what that means," she said, her tone even, and Ethan understood immediately that this was not a door opening. It was a path being observed, one that would require more than words to walk, and he accepted that without hesitation, because for the first time, he was not looking for immediate resolution. He was willing to remain within the uncertainty, to let it unfold without forcing it into something defined. The music continued, the room moved, the evening carried on, but the center of Ethan's focus had shifted entirely, no longer anchored to the stage or the expectations that had once defined him, but to the quiet presence of a woman and a child who had altered the trajectory of his night, and, perhaps more than that, the trajectory of something he had not yet fully named. Daniel looked up at him once more, his expression open, steady, and without hesitation, he said, "You can sit with us if you want." The invitation simple, unforced, and Ethan paused for just a moment before nodding. "I would like that," he replied, and as they moved together toward a small table near the edge of the room, away from the center but not hidden, something shifted again, something subtle but real, a transition from standing across from each other to existing within the same space. And for Ethan Caldwell, that step, small as it seemed, carried more significance than any decision he had made earlier that night, because it was not about control, it was about presence, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The table they moved to was not hidden, but it was removed just enough from the center of the ballroom that the noise softened into something manageable, a quieter pocket of space where conversations blended into a distant hum and the sharp edges of attention dulled into occasional glances rather than constant observation. And for Ethan Caldwell, that shift in distance felt unfamiliar in a way he could not ignore, because for years he had been the center of every room he entered, not by accident but by design, and now he sat at the edge of his own event, not diminished, but repositioned, not leading, but present. Daniel climbed into his chair with an ease that came from habit, setting his small plate carefully in front of him before glancing between Ava and Ethan as if confirming that this arrangement, this shared space, was real and allowed, and when neither objected, he settled in fully, his attention already moving toward the small details around him, the texture of the tablecloth, the reflections in the glassware, the quiet rhythm of people passing by, and Ethan watched him with a focus that felt different from anything he had experienced before, not analytical, not strategic, but attentive in a way that did not seek to control or predict. Ava took her seat across from Daniel, her posture straight but relaxed, her presence steady, and when she looked at Ethan, there was no invitation in her expression, no rejection either, only a neutral acceptance of the moment as it existed, and that neutrality, that refusal to define the interaction prematurely, set the tone more clearly than any words could have. Ethan lowered himself into the chair beside them, the movement deliberate, his posture instinctively composed but softened at the edges, as if some part of him understood that the usual structure he carried did not belong fully in this space. And for a moment, the three of them sat without speaking, the silence not empty, but layered with everything that had already been acknowledged and everything that had yet to be understood. The music shifted again, a slower piece now, the notes stretching longer between transitions, filling the air with something that felt less like performance and more like atmosphere, and the lights above them dimmed slightly, casting a softer glow across the table, creating a sense of distance from the rest of the room even as the event continued around them. Daniel reached for another small dessert, carefully selecting it before taking a bite, his attention briefly focused on the simple task, and then he looked up at Ethan again, his expression thoughtful but calm. "What do you do when you are not working?" he asked, the question direct, unfiltered, and Ethan paused for a moment, not because he did not understand it, but because the answer was not something he had ever needed to define in this way. He considered the question longer than expected, his gaze lowering slightly, as if searching for something that did not immediately present itself. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet honesty that surprised even him. "I do not do much outside of work," he admitted, the words simple, but carrying a weight that extended beyond their meaning. And Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the response without judgment, as if placing it alongside everything else he was learning in this moment. Ava's gaze rested on Ethan for a second longer than before, not questioning, not reacting, simply acknowledging the truth in what he had said, and there was something in that acknowledgement that made the air between them shift again, not dramatically, but enough to mark the difference between what had been assumed and what was now understood. A server approached the table quietly, placing a glass of water in front of each of them before moving on without interruption, and the small, routine action grounded the moment in something familiar, something ordinary, and Ethan found himself noticing it in a way he had not before. The simplicity of it, the absence of expectation, the way it existed, without needing to be directed or controlled. Daniel took a sip from his glass, then leaned back slightly in his chair, his attention returning to Ethan. "Mom says people change," he said, his tone thoughtful, not challenging, not questioning, simply stating something he had been told, and Ethan felt the words settle into him with a quiet clarity, because they did not demand proof, they simply acknowledged possibility. "She is right," Ethan replied after a brief pause, his voice steady but softer than before. "People can change," and as he said it, he realized that the statement was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, present, something that applied to him in a way he could not distance himself from. Ava watched the exchange closely, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight easing that suggested she was listening not just to the words, but to the sincerity behind them, measuring something that could not be confirmed in a single moment, but could begin there. Daniel nodded again, satisfied with the answer, and turned his attention briefly to the room, watching as people moved, talked, laughed, their interactions forming a backdrop that felt both distant and connected. And then he looked back at Ethan with a quiet curiosity. "Do you know how to play anything?" he asked, glancing toward the small stage where a piano sat under the soft glow of a spotlight, and Ethan followed his gaze, the question catching him slightly off guard, because it pointed to something outside of the structure he was used to, something personal, something unmeasured. "I used to play the piano," Ethan said slowly, the memory surfacing with a clarity he had not expected, "a long time ago." And Daniel's eyes brightened just slightly. "You should play," he said simply, the suggestion unforced, carrying no expectation beyond the idea itself. And Ethan felt a faint shift at those words, because they opened a possibility he had not considered, not in years, not in a life that had moved too quickly to return to things that did not serve a purpose. Ava's gaze moved briefly to the piano and then back to Ethan, her expression unreadable, but there was something in the way she looked at him that suggested she understood the significance of the suggestion, not because of the action itself, but because of what it represented, a step outside of the version of himself he had built so carefully. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes still resting on the piano, the memory of something quieter, something less defined by control, beginning to surface in a way that felt both distant and immediate. And for a moment, he did not respond. He simply allowed the possibility to exist, unforced, undefined. The music continued, the room moved, the night carried on, but at the edge of it, at a small table removed just enough from the center, something else had begun to take shape, something quieter, something more deliberate. And as Ethan Caldwell sat there, no longer standing apart from what he had once left behind, he realized that change did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself in moments like this, small, unguarded, and impossible to ignore. The suggestion did not disappear after it was spoken. It stayed in the air between them, quiet but persistent, and Ethan Caldwell found himself looking at the piano longer than he intended, as if the distance between where he sat and where it stood held more than just physical space. It held time, years he had moved past without looking back, choices that had narrowed his world into something efficient but incomplete. And for a moment, just long enough to feel unfamiliar, he allowed himself to consider what it would mean to stand up and walk toward it without a reason that could be measured or justified. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, watching Ethan with a kind of open anticipation that did not demand anything but quietly hoped. And that small shift in posture carried a weight Ethan could not ignore, because it was not expectation in the way he understood it, it was curiosity, a willingness to see something new. And that difference mattered more than he expected. Ava's gaze rested on him as well, not urging, not discouraging, simply observing, her expression calm, steady, and there was something in the way she looked at him that made it clear she was not measuring the act itself. She was measuring the choice behind it, whether he would remain within the structure he had built or step, even slightly, outside of it. The music from the small ensemble began to wind down, the final notes stretching into silence as the musicians paused, preparing for the next transition. And in that brief gap, the piano stood alone under the soft light, unclaimed, waiting without intention, and Ethan felt the moment align in a way that could not be planned. He placed his hands lightly on the edge of the table, then pushed back his chair with a quiet movement, not abrupt, not dramatic, just enough to signal a decision. And when he stood, the shift was subtle but immediate, a few nearby conversations slowing, a few glances turning, not because of what he was doing, but because of who he was, and what it meant when he stepped away from the expected. Daniel's eyes followed him, bright with interest, and Ava remained seated, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. And Ethan walked toward the piano without looking back, each step measured but no longer calculated, guided by something he had not relied on in years, something quieter than logic, but no less certain. When he reached the instrument, he paused for a second, his hand resting lightly against the polished surface, feeling the coolness of it, the familiarity that had not entirely faded despite the time that had passed. And as he took his seat on the bench, the room seemed to hold a different kind of stillness, not forced, not expectant, but attentive in a way that did not belong to the program of the evening. His fingers hovered above the keys for a moment, not because he did not remember how, but because he understood that this was not about performance, not about precision or skill. It was about something else, something that did not require perfection, only presence. And when he finally pressed the first note, it came out soft, steady, carrying a tone that felt both distant and immediate, like a memory returning without being called. The melody that followed was simple, not elaborate, not designed to impress, but it carried a quiet rhythm that filled the space in a way that words could not. And as the notes continued, something shifted in the room. Conversations quieted, movement slowed, attention gathered not because it was demanded, but because it was drawn naturally towards something real. Ethan did not look up as he played, his focus not on the audience, not on the room, but on the keys beneath his hands, on the sound that formed from each movement. And for the first time that night, for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about outcomes or impressions. He was simply allowing the moment to exist. At the table, Daniel watched with complete stillness, his attention fully absorbed, his earlier curiosity settling into something deeper, something closer to understanding. And Ava's gaze remained fixed on Ethan as well, but her expression carried a different layer, one shaped by recognition, not of the music itself, but of the person behind it, the part of him that had existed before the choices that had separated them, the part that had not been erased, only set aside. The melody continued, shifting slightly, growing more confident as his hands moved with greater ease, and though it remained simple, it carried a sense of continuity, as if bridging something that had once been broken, not repairing it fully, not resolving it, but connecting the space between what had been and what now existed. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, holding the weight of what had just happened in a way that no immediate reaction could interrupt, and for a brief second, Ethan remained still, his hands resting lightly on the keys, his breath steady, his mind clear in a way that did not rely on control. Then the room responded, not with the sharp applause that usually followed a performance, but with something softer, more genuine, a wave of appreciation that built gradually, respectful rather than performative, and Ethan stood slowly, turning back toward the table where Ava and Daniel sat, his expression composed but altered, something in it more open, less defined by the rigid certainty that had once shaped every movement. Daniel smiled. As he approached, not wide, not exaggerated, just real, and when Ethan returned to his seat, the boy spoke without hesitation. "You are good," he said simply, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh, not dismissive, not self-conscious, but genuine in a way that surprised him. "Thank you," he replied, his voice softer now, carrying a warmth that had not been present earlier in the evening. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, and though she did not speak, there was something in her eyes that acknowledged what had just happened, not as a performance, not as a gesture meant to impress, but as a choice, a small but significant step outside of the man he had once been, and that acknowledgement, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything else in the room. The music resumed behind them, the evening continuing its course, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and as Ethan sat there, no longer defined by the expectations that had once guided him, he realized that the distance between who he had been and who he might become was no longer fixed. It was something that could change, one moment at a time, and for the first time, that possibility did not feel uncertain, it felt necessary. The applause faded gradually, not disappearing all at once, but settling into the background like a memory that refused to fully leave. And as Ethan Caldwell returned to his seat, something within him remained different, not visibly, not in a way the room could immediately define, but internally, in the way his thoughts no longer aligned with the rhythm he had followed for years. The structure that had once guided every decision now felt incomplete, as if something essential had been missing and had only now begun to reveal itself. Daniel watched him closely, his small hands resting on the edge of the table, his attention steady and unfiltered, and when Ethan sat down, the boy leaned forward slightly. "Why did you stop playing?" he asked, the question simple, but layered with a curiosity that did not carry judgment, only a desire to understand, and Ethan paused, his gaze lowering for a moment as if searching through years he had not revisited, not because they were painful, but because they had been set aside, deemed unnecessary in the pursuit of something larger. "I thought it was not important anymore," he said slowly, his voice quieter than before, each word chosen not for precision but for honesty. "I had other things to focus on." And Daniel nodded, absorbing the answer in the same way he had absorbed everything else, without rushing to fill the silence that followed. Ava's eyes remained on Ethan, her expression calm, but there was something deeper in her gaze now, something that recognized not just what he was saying, but what he was beginning to understand, and that recognition did not soften her, did not draw her closer, but it acknowledged a shift that could not be ignored. The music from the ensemble resumed, filling the space with a light melody that contrasted with the quiet intensity of the table, and around them, the gala continued, conversations growing louder again, laughter returning, the room reclaiming its rhythm. But the center of Ethan's attention had moved completely, no longer tied to the expectations of the event, but to the quiet presence across from him. "Mom plays music sometimes," Daniel added, glancing at Ava with a small smile, and Ethan's gaze followed, settling on her with a renewed awareness, as if realizing there were parts of her life he had never known, never considered, and Ava met his gaze briefly before responding, her voice even. "Only when there is time," she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more meaning than it revealed, because it spoke of a life filled with priorities that had required sacrifice, discipline, and focus, a life that had not waited for ideal conditions to exist. Ethan nodded slowly, the connection forming in a way that did not require explanation, and for a moment, the silence between them shifted again, no longer heavy with the past, but filled with a quiet understanding of what had been built in its absence. Daniel reached for his glass of water, taking a small sip before setting it back down, his attention returning to Ethan. "Do you have time now?" he asked, the question direct, and Ethan felt it land with a weight that extended beyond its simplicity, because it was not just about the moment. It was about what came next, about the space he was willing to create in a life that had once left no room for anything unplanned. He did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood that the answer mattered in a way that required more than instinct. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that came from decision rather than habit. "I can make time," he said. And the words, though simple, marked a shift that could not be undone, because they acknowledged something he had once refused to consider. Ava watched him closely, her gaze steady, and there was a subtle change in the air between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition, the acknowledgement that he was no longer speaking from the same place he had before, and that difference, though small, was real. A man approached the table then, his posture respectful but cautious, one of the board members who had been waiting for an opportunity to speak with Ethan, and he cleared his throat lightly. "Mr. Caldwell, when you have a moment, the investors would like to," but Ethan raised his hand slightly, not dismissive, not abrupt, just enough to pause the interruption, and the man stopped immediately, stepping back without argument, because the signal was clear, and for the first time in years, Ethan had chosen something else over the expectations that usually dictated his time. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet interest, his eyes moving between the two men, and then back to Ethan. "You are busy," he said, not as a complaint, not as a judgment, just as an observation, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the truth without trying to minimize it. "I have been," he said, the past tense deliberate, intentional, and Daniel considered that for a moment before nodding, as if accepting the distinction without needing it to be explained further. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture still composed, her presence unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself, as if recognizing that the conversation had moved into a space that could not be defined by a single evening, and that whatever came next would not be immediate. It would be something that unfolded over time. "This does not change what has been," she said quietly, her voice calm, not cold, not distant, simply clear, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, understanding immediately that she was not closing a door, she was setting a boundary, one that acknowledged the past without allowing it to be rewritten by a single moment. "I know," he replied, his voice steady, and there was no resistance in it, no attempt to argue or persuade, only acceptance, because he understood now that what stood between them was not something that could be resolved with words. It would require something else. Something he had not yet fully defined but was beginning to understand. Daniel looked between them again, his expression thoughtful, and then he spoke, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that did not belong to the complexity of the moment. "Mom says people show who they are over time," he said, and the statement settled into the space between them with a clarity that did not require interpretation. And Ethan felt it land with a weight that was both grounding and challenging, because it removed the possibility of immediate resolution, replacing it with something more demanding, consistency. He nodded slowly, the movement deliberate. "She is right," he said again, and this time the words carried a deeper understanding, not just of the idea, but of what it required from him. The music continued, the room moved, the night carried on, but at the table near the edge of the ballroom, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not because it had been resolved, but because it had been acknowledged. And as Ethan Caldwell sat there, no longer separated from the reality he had once chosen to leave behind, he understood that what came next would not be defined by a single decision, but by every decision that followed. And for the first time, That did not feel like pressure. It felt like responsibility, something quieter, something steadier, something he was no longer willing to ignore. The statement about time did not drift away. It settled, anchoring itself into the space between them with a quiet permanence that no one at the table tried to disturb, and Ethan Caldwell felt it fully now, not as an abstract idea, not as something he could analyze or negotiate, but as something that would measure him in ways no boardroom ever had, something that would not respond to urgency or status, only to consistency. And as he sat there, the weight of that realization did not press down on him. It steadied him, grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his small hands resting against the edge of the table as he looked between Ava and Ethan with a thoughtful calm that did not match his age, and yet carried a clarity that made every word he spoke land with quiet precision. "So you have to show it," he said simply, not as a challenge, not as a conclusion, but as an observation shaped by what he had been taught, and Ethan nodded once, the movement slow, deliberate, because there was nothing to argue against, nothing to correct, only something to accept. Ava's gaze remained steady on Ethan, her posture unchanged, her expression calm but not distant, and there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, a presence that did not shift with the conversation, did not soften with the moment, because she had already lived through the part of the story where words had failed her, and what remained now was something different, something that required proof beyond anything spoken. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, his posture no longer rigid, but not entirely relaxed either, as if adjusting to a space where control did not define his presence. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet sincerity that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. "I will," he said, not loudly, not with emphasis, but with a steadiness that suggested he understood what the statement required. And Ava held his gaze for a moment longer before responding, her voice calm. "Even, you will not say it," she said, her tone not harsh, not dismissive, but clear. "You will do it." And the distinction landed with a finality that did not leave room for interpretation, because it was not a rejection. It was a boundary, one that defined the terms without needing to negotiate them. Ethan did not look away, did not attempt to respond immediately, because he recognized the truth in her words, and for once, silence felt more appropriate than anything he could add. And in that silence, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that altered the foundation of the moment, replacing assumption with understanding. The music in the background softened again, the tempo slower now, creating a rhythm that felt less like an event and more like an atmosphere. And around them, the gala continued to unfold, conversations weaving through the space, laughter rising and falling, but at the small table near the edge of the room, the focus remained contained, steady, and deeply present. Daniel reached for another small dessert, carefully placing it on his plate before glancing up at Ethan again, his expression open, unguarded. "Do you have a house?" he asked, the question simple, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a smile, the shift subtle but real. "Yes," he replied. "I do." And Daniel nodded, absorbing the answer before continuing. "Do you live there alone?" And the question, though innocent, carried a quiet weight, because it reached into a part of Ethan's life that had remained untouched by everything else that had been discussed. Ethan paused briefly, not because he was unsure of the answer, but because he understood what it revealed. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady, and Daniel considered that for a moment before nodding again, his response simple. "That sounds quiet." And Ethan felt the truth of that statement settle into him with a clarity that did not require elaboration, because quiet had been his choice, his design, his control, and now, sitting here, it felt different, not wrong, but incomplete. Ava's gaze softened slightly, not in a way that erased distance, but in a way that acknowledged the shift in the conversation, the way it had moved from the surface into something more personal without force, without pressure, and she watched Ethan carefully, not waiting for a response, not expecting one, simply observing how he carried what had been said. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to the table, and for the first time, the environment around him felt secondary, not because it had changed, but because his focus had, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet reflection that did not seek to impress or persuade. "It has been quiet for a long time," he admitted, and the words, though simple, marked a shift that extended beyond the moment. Because they acknowledged something he had not previously considered worth naming. Daniel looked at him with a thoughtful expression, his small hands now resting still on the table, and then he said, "Maybe it does not have to be." And the statement, simple and unguarded, landed with a weight that no structured conversation could replicate, because it was not shaped by expectation, it was shaped by possibility, and Ethan felt it settle into him in a way that felt both immediate and lasting. Ava glanced at Daniel briefly, a faint hint of warmth passing through her expression before she returned her gaze to Ethan. And in that brief moment, something unspoken moved between them, not agreement, not reconciliation, but recognition. The understanding that the conversation had reached a point where the next steps could not be guided by words alone. The music continued, the room moved, the evening carried on, but the center of Ethan Caldwell's world had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and as he sat there, no longer separated from the reality he had once left behind, he understood that what stood before him was not something to resolve. It was something to build, slowly, deliberately, with actions that would define more than any statement ever could. And for the first time, that path did not feel uncertain. It felt necessary, something he was ready to step into, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The possibility Daniel had spoken did not fade into the background. It stayed, quiet but present, shaping the space around them in a way that felt both fragile and steady at the same time. And Ethan Caldwell found himself holding on to it not as an idea, but as something tangible, something that could exist if he chose to let it, if he chose to step into it fully rather than observe it from a distance. The table remained a small island within the larger room, the hum of the gala continuing. Around them, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking softly, the orchestra shifting into another slow piece that wrapped the space in a calm rhythm. But none of it carried the same weight as the quiet exchange that had settled between the three of them, something that no longer needed attention from the outside to remain significant. Ava adjusted her posture slightly, her hand resting near Daniel's shoulder, not holding him this time, but close enough to ground him, to remind him without words that she was there. And when she looked at Ethan again, there was no urgency in her expression, no expectation, only a calm awareness that whatever came next would not be decided here, not in a single evening, not in a single conversation. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting lightly against the edge of the table, his posture no longer rigid, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet intention that had not been present earlier, something more deliberate, more aware. "What do you like to do?" he asked, his attention focused on Daniel, not as a way to fill the silence, but as a genuine attempt to understand something he had missed, something that had existed without him. Daniel's eyes lit up slightly, the question simple but meaningful, and he answered without hesitation. "I like drawing," he said, his voice steady, "and I build things with blocks, and Mom reads to me at night." And each part of the answer landed with a quiet significance, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, a life filled with moments that had been lived without Ethan's presence, a routine shaped by consistency and care. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the details, allowing them to settle without trying to organize them into something else. And for a moment, he pictured it, the small routines, the quiet evenings, the steady presence that had shaped Daniel's world. And the realization did not arrive as regret alone. It arrived as clarity, a clear understanding of what had been built and what he had not been part of. Ava watched him carefully, her gaze steady, and though she did not speak, there was something in the way she held that silence that made it clear she was allowing him to process this without interruption, without guidance, because this was not something she could explain for him. It was something he had to understand on his own. "What do you draw?" Ethan asked after a moment, his voice still quiet, and Daniel smiled slightly, his attention fully engaged now. "Houses, mostly," he said. "And sometimes people." And he paused briefly before adding, "I draw Mom a lot." And the simplicity of the statement carried a depth that did not need explanation, because it spoke of presence, of familiarity, of someone who had always been there. Ethan felt the words settle into him with a quiet intensity, and for a second, he did not respond, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood what was not being said, what had not been drawn, what had not been included, and that absence was something he could not ignore. Ava's gaze softened just slightly, not in a way that erased the truth, but in a way that acknowledged it. And she looked at Daniel with a quiet warmth that contrasted with the steadiness she maintained when looking at Ethan. Because the connection she shared with her son did not require explanation, it existed fully, completely, without condition. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to the table. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, something more reflective, more grounded. "I would like to see your drawings sometime," he said, not as a request that demanded an answer, but as an opening, a possibility that did not assume acceptance. Daniel looked at Ava instinctively, his expression questioning but hopeful, and Ava met his gaze before looking back at Ethan, her response measured, her tone calm. "We will see," she said, and the words were neither an agreement nor a refusal. They were a boundary, one that allowed for possibility without offering certainty, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it without hesitation, because he understood now that nothing would be given easily. Not trust, not access, not time. Everything would have to be earned. The music continued, the room moved, and a few more guests approached the table briefly, offering polite greetings to Ethan before moving on, their presence acknowledged but not engaged, because for the first time, Ethan did not shift his focus to meet them. He remained where he was, his attention grounded in the moment rather than pulled by expectation. Daniel reached for his glass again, taking a small sip before setting it down, and then he looked at Ethan once more, his voice carrying the same quiet curiosity that had guided every question he had asked. "Will you come again?" And the question, though simple, carried a different kind of weight, not about the present, but about the future, about whether this moment would remain isolated or continue beyond the boundaries of the evening. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because he understood what the question required, and when he spoke, his voice carried a steady clarity that had not been there before. "Yes," he said, "I will come again," and the words, though simple, were not spoken lightly. They were grounded in intention, in a decision that extended beyond the moment. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the air between them, something that acknowledged the statement without confirming it, something that recognized it as a beginning rather than a resolution, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. The orchestra transitioned into another piece, the notes rising gently through the room, and the gala continued to unfold around them. But the center of Ethan Caldwell's focus remained unchanged, anchored to the quiet presence at the table, to the reality that had re-entered his life not with force, but with certainty. And as he sat there, no longer separate from what he had once left behind, he understood that this was not a moment to hold on to. It was a moment to build from, something that would require patience, consistency, and a willingness to remain present even when the outcome was not guaranteed. And for the first time, that did not feel like a risk. It felt like the only direction that made sense. The promise to return did not echo loudly. It settled quietly into the space between them, not as something to be celebrated or questioned, but as something that would exist only if it was followed through. And Ethan Caldwell understood that now in a way he had not understood anything earlier that night, because for the first time, words alone did not feel sufficient. They felt like the beginning of something that required proof, something that would unfold beyond the walls of the ballroom, beyond the lights and music and controlled environment he had spent years mastering. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his small frame relaxed, his curiosity momentarily satisfied, and as he glanced around the room again, the world seemed to return to him in pieces, the soft music, the movement of people, the quiet clinking of glasses, and yet his attention always returned to the table, to the presence that had shifted his understanding in a way he did not yet fully grasp but instinctively accepted. Ava remained composed, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But there was a quiet awareness in the way she observed Ethan now, not with distance, not with expectation, but with a clarity that came from having already lived through uncertainty, already built something stable, without relying on what stood in front of her. And that stability, that quiet independence, defined the boundary of everything that could happen next. Ethan sat there for a moment longer, allowing the rhythm of the room to continue around him without pulling him away. And then he spoke again, his voice steady, measured, but carrying something new, something grounded. "I will not interfere with what you have built," he said, his gaze meeting Ava's directly. "But I would like to be part of it, in the way you allow." And the words, though simple, marked a shift in understanding, because they did not assume a place. They acknowledged that any place would have to be given, not taken. Ava held his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable at first, and then she nodded once, a small movement that carried no promise, no resolution, but an acknowledgement that he had spoken from a different place than before, and that alone mattered more than anything else he could have said. Daniel looked between them again, sensing the shift without fully understanding its weight, and then he smiled slightly, not because everything was resolved, but because something had changed in a way that felt steady rather than uncertain, and he reached for another small piece of dessert, breaking the tension in the simplest way possible, returning the moment to something grounded, something real. The music swelled again, a slightly brighter piece now, signaling a transition in the evening, and across the ballroom, the energy shifted, people moving more freely, conversations growing louder, the event continuing as if nothing had changed, and yet for Ethan, everything had, because the center of his attention, of his priorities, had moved in a way that could not be reversed. A few more guests approached, offering polite words, brief acknowledgments. But Ethan responded with minimal engagement, his focus remaining at the table, not out of dismissal, but out of choice, because for the first time, he was not allowing the expectations of the room to dictate where his attention belonged. Ava noticed this, the way he remained present, the way he did not shift away when it would have been easier to do so. And though she did not comment on it, the awareness was there, quiet but clear, a recognition that something in him had begun to change not in words, but in action. Daniel finished his dessert and wiped his hands carefully with a napkin, his movements deliberate in a way that reflected the structure Ava had given him. And then he looked up at Ethan once more, his expression open, steady. "Are you going to come next time?" he asked, repeating the question in a different form, not because he doubted the answer, but because he wanted to understand its shape, its certainty. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation this time, his voice steady, grounded in something deeper than before. "Yes," he said again, "and I will let you know before I do." And the addition, small as it was, carried a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that showing up was not enough. It had to be done with intention, with respect for the life that had already been built. Ava's eyes remained on him for a moment longer, and there was a subtle shift in her expression, not softening, not fully, but easing in a way that acknowledged the difference between presence and intrusion, and she nodded once, a silent acceptance of the boundary he had just recognized. The evening continued, the music carried on, and eventually, the time came when the rhythm of the night began to slow, guests preparing to leave, conversations drawing to a close, the controlled environment returning to its natural end. And as Ava stood, guiding Daniel gently to his feet, the moment shifted again, not ending, but transitioning. Ethan stood as well, his movement immediate but unforced, and for a second, the three of them stood facing each other, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by something more deliberate, something that had been acknowledged and would now have to be carried forward beyond this room. Daniel stepped slightly closer to Ava, his hand finding hers again, and then he looked up at Ethan with the same calm expression he had carried all evening. "Good night," he said, his voice steady, and Ethan felt the simplicity of the words settle into him with a weight that extended beyond the moment, because it marked not an ending, but a pause. "Good night, Daniel," Ethan replied, his voice quieter now, but no less certain, and he glanced briefly at Ava, his gaze steady, not searching, not expecting, simply present. "Good night," he added, and Ava met his gaze for a moment before responding, her voice calm. "Good night, Ethan." And the way she said his name, steady, composed, carried no trace of the past, only the acknowledgement of who he was in this moment. They turned then, Ava guiding Daniel toward the exit with a quiet confidence that had defined her from the moment she entered the room, and Ethan remained where he stood, watching them go, not with urgency, not with regret, but with a clarity that had not existed before, because he understood now that this was not something to chase. It was something to meet, step by step, with consistency and intention. The doors closed behind them softly, the sound barely noticeable against the music and conversation that continued. But for Ethan, it marked a shift that could not be undone. And as he stood there, no longer the center of the room, but no longer defined by it either, he realized that everything he had built, everything he had prioritized, now existed alongside something else, something quieter, something more demanding, something that required not power, but presence. And for the first time, he did not turn away from that realization. He stepped into it, fully, without hesitation, because he understood that this was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one he would have to earn.